Thank you for reading from the story of Ruth this morning. It's a short book. It's only about 4 chapters or so, and we touched on a couple highlights there for you. And you might be thinking, okay, isn't this Christmas time? Why are we reading this story about this woman named Ruth, this guy named Boaz, and all these other folks? What's going on here? How does this connect with Christmas? With the story of Jesus, the child born of a virgin, placed in a manger. The shepherds hear the angel choirs and come to see this one that is born. The kings come from far away to worship this Jesus. This is the story we're familiar with. So why Ruth and Boaz? And the story from the Old Testament, long, long before Jesus. This season of Advent is about waiting and anticipating. In a time of waiting and anticipating, you are constantly looking for signs of what you are hoping for, what you're waiting for, signs that it is going to happen sometime soon. At Christmas time, we celebrate the coming of Jesus, the Savior of the world. And today, as followers of this Jesus, we anticipate and we are waiting for his coming again, as promised. That he will come to redeem the world and to set all things right. And so we are waiting. And while we wait, in this time of anticipation, we are looking for signs of his coming. These last number of weeks, in these 4 weeks of Advent, we've been looking at some people that are listed in the genealogy, the story, the list of the people who are the ancestors of this Jesus. And what we have found in Matthew chapter 1, in this genealogy that goes from Abraham, with whom God made a covenant, all the way through Jesus, in which that promise is fulfilled, we've seen that there are a whole bunch of names, but 4 in particular which catch our attention. Those 4 names are the names of women, which makes us pause. Because in a patriarchal society, why would the names of these women be listed in the genealogy? It doesn't quite make sense. And then when we look a little closer, we realize that the 4 women whose names are there, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, all 4 of these women are not even Israelite women. These are outsiders from somewhere else. And when we look even closer, we realize that these outsider women have messy stories. Stories filled with brokenness, suffering, death. Why would these women be part of the genealogy of Jesus? What we've been examining and seeing here in this genealogy and these 4 women is that God chooses and uses unexpected people to bring about and to demonstrate his love for the world. This morning, we look at Ruth's unexpected story. And what we learn here in this story of Ruth is that for God, the way of love aligns with who God is. And that it is the way of love and an unexpected way of including others, unexpected inclusion. And it is this way that God shows his grace and his compassion for all people in all times. We also can see here in the story of Ruth that God works through the loyal love of people to bring about the good. And in this case, that Ruth herself is honored and welcomed and becomes part of the lineage of the Redeemer, not only of Israel, but of all people. Through her and through these women, the family line of Jesus shows and demonstrates God's loyal love for us. So if you're wondering where to find this story of Ruth, it's found in your Bibles right between Judges and Samuel. Now, if you're wondering, it's really close to the beginning of the Bible. You have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Don't worry if you don't remember those names. Those are the first 5 books of the law. That's where we hear the story of God's creation, and we hear about this chosen people, and God makes a promise with Abraham, and how he leads them, and how they're in Egypt, and he takes them out of Egypt and rescues them, and he gives them laws that they should live by, and he tells them who they are and how they have been chosen by him in love, and he calls them to be his people. The story that you may be familiar with is when they come from Egypt, out of slavery, they are promised to be taken into a new land, a land of Canaan. And as they go into that land and they inherit the promise that God has given them, they settle in that land. But that land wasn't unoccupied. There were already people that were living there too. Those people were known by different names. There were the Canaanites, there were the Edomites, and there were also this group called the Moabites, the people of Moab. As you can imagine, the people that lived in the land weren't all that happy about this other group coming in and living in the land and taking over. And so they were enemies in many ways. And this story happens at this time shortly after the people of Israel have entered into this promised land and they've settled down. They don't have kings yet. The people of Israel, they don't have a king. They have the descendants of Moses and Aaron, the priests and the prophet, who are giving them guidance as a people. And they have these people called judges that come up as leaders among them to guide them during dark and difficult days. Some of those judges that you might be familiar with are people like Gideon or people like Samson, and you can read those stories in the book of Judges. This story about Ruth happens in that time of Judges. In fact, it's a really short story, and you may wonder, well, why didn't they just take this story and put it into the book of Judges? Because it comes right after it in the order in our Bibles. I think there's a very profound reason why it's not included there. And that's because in Judges, what you find is a pattern where the people have been doing their own thing. It says that because there was no king and because they were just kind of on their own, it says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. When hard times came, when conflicts came, when struggles came, everyone just kind of they did what they thought was best. But over and over again, it shows in Judges that what they thought was best was not the good that God had for them. And then God would raise a judge to come and to lead them and to help them back to the right path and to faithfulness with God. But the story of Ruth is different. Rather than a story of failure and turning away, what we see in the story of Ruth is a story of light, a story where there are good choices being made. But surprisingly, the good choices and choosing the right thing is not the Israelites. It's actually an outsider who comes to be part of the Israelites that demonstrates what the goodness and love of God looks like. It's a counterpoint to the stories of struggle in Judges. So let's think a little bit about this story of Ruth and how it fits here. As you've heard me say many times before, when you read the Old Testament, there are layers on layers on layers of meaning. There's the story itself from which you can take, oh, I get it. God was teaching us a lesson, or the prophets had something to say that we ought to pay attention to. And then when you look a little bit closer, you see that there is much, much more beneath the surface. So we have in the book of Ruth the story of a family from Bethlehem. Have you ever heard of a family from Bethlehem before? Maybe. Bethlehem connects to the story of Jesus. And in Bethlehem, which is called the house of bread, that's what the name Bethlehem means, it says that there's a famine. There's no food in the house of bread. And there's this family, Elimelech and Naomi. Elimelech, his name means that God is the king. And Naomi, her name means pleasant and nice. What a happy little family, right? God is king and pleasant and nice. I'd like to get to know those folks. And they have 2 children, 2 sons, living here in the house of bread where there is no food. Their first son, his name is Mahlon. It's an interesting name, Mahlon. In Hebrew, Mahlon means sick and weak. Oh, something's not right here. And then they have a second son whose name is Kilian. And Kilian means failing or wasting away. Something is definitely not right in the house of bread. There's a famine. There is darkness. There is need. And so Elimelech and Naomi, they make a plan. How are we going to survive? What should we do? And as it says in the book of Judges, everyone does what is right in their own eyes. And so they leave the house of bread in Bethlehem and they go to Moab, enemy territory, where there seems to be food, or they hope that perhaps they might find a future. But what happens when they get there is not what they wanted. Have you ever had this experience in your own life? Is there anything that's worse than going to a place where there's supposed to be something good for you and instead it's empty? I mean, this happens to me all the time because I shop at Superstore. I go when I have time to do some grocery shopping, which sometimes happens to be on a Saturday evening. And I get there and I have my grocery list and I get to the spot at the shelf where the thing is that I need and it's empty. Or there's one left, but it's dented or broken or something. There's a reason why it's left on the shelf. And I go, I came all this way and I need this, and it's not here for me. Isn't a grocery store supposed to have the food that I need for my family? What a disappointment. But that's a pretty minor kind of disappointment. There's all kinds of other places that we go where there's supposed to be something good, but instead we find emptiness. Sometimes we find in our friendships that where we expect to find support and care and encouragement, rather we find judgment, or we're being used by the person we thought cared for us. Or in our marriages, where we think our spouse ought to be the one that gives us unconditional love and acceptance. In our brokenness, instead, we experience rejection. Or in our families, where we expect to be embraced and comforted and loved and welcomed in. Instead, we find hurt, or maybe worse, we're ignored and left on our own. This is the story of Ruth's in-laws. They go from the house of bread to another place, hoping to find food and sustenance for their family, and instead find emptiness. And their sons, who marry, they find wives, but soon after they die, and there are no children to carry on the family name and the family legacy. So Naomi, in defeat, is going to go back home, go back to Bethlehem. And this is where Ruth's place in the story begins. When Naomi says that she's going, Ruth says, I'm coming with you. Do you know what Ruth's name means in Hebrew? Ruth means compassionate friend. Someone who loves and cares. This Moabite woman, a woman from an enemy tribe, an enemy nation, chooses to stay with Naomi. It's clear from the story that she's old enough to get married again after her first husband has died, this Israelite husband. It's clear that she could marry again and she could stay with someone in her own culture, in her own place, and be accepted and have a future. But instead, she chooses to leave her own tribe, her own family, her own community, and to enter a place that is hostile to her. Why would she do that? The story says that she does this out of compassion and deep and loyal love for her mother-in-law, Naomi. So they get to Israel. They return to Bethlehem, where Naomi has a small parcel of land that belongs to their family, to her husband Elimelech, who has also passed away at this time. And they have this place to live, but they have nothing else. They're barely getting by. And Naomi's getting older, and Ruth is taking care of her. So she goes out to help to get some food by going to the fields where the people are harvesting and taking from the edges or finding the grains that have dropped onto the ground. This is kind of like going to the food bank in our community. But consider this. She's an outsider, enemy in the community that she lives. She's a widow. She has no resources. She is highly vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. We even hear in the story where Boaz at one point says, hey, only do this in my fields, because I'm going to make sure that my people take care of you and don't abuse you and exploit you, but be careful, because if you go somewhere else, things could go really badly. She is vulnerable. She is alone. And yet she chooses this because of her love for Naomi, her chosen family. Boaz in this story also demonstrates what faithfulness looks like. A faithfulness to his family responsibilities, his kinship responsibilities. As we hear of him redeeming the land and purchasing it. And also, together with that, as we heard in the story read this morning, taking on the responsibility for Elimelech's family legacy and continuing the line of Elimelech, which means that it won't die out and be forgotten. This is a story of deep, abiding love and loyalty. When I think about the world that we live in today, the world that you and I inhabit, it mirrors in many ways the time of the judges, of the people of Israel living without a king. And when times are difficult and challenging, everyone kind of does what they think is right, but so often it's just the wrong path. It leads away from God. It leads away from truth. it leads only to emptiness. The other thing that happens in our world is that the things that we have been given, the inheritance and blessing of God in this world that He has created for us, and the gifts that He has given to us that are meant to bless us, to sustain us, to nurture and build us up, so often in our experience and in the world that we live in, they've been twisted until they become something quite the opposite of what they were intended for. Gifts that are meant for our good have become tools of destruction in our lives. Where strength and power has been given, which is meant for the good, to accomplish the good for ourselves and for others, so often we see that it is used instead to dominate and tear down and to gather resources for oneself rather than to share and to care for the community. Where there are gifts like insight and wisdom, those gifts in our society so often are used to manipulate others for selfish gain instead of lifting others up. Within our own person, the physical desires that we have been given as a gift from our Creator rather have been twisted to lusts and demands for our own satisfaction rather than bringing us to a place of unity and true intimacy in relationship. Relationships that we have been given by God and the potential for community has been twisted instead into tribalism in which we draw boundaries about who is in and who is out, who belongs and who does not. What we see in Ruth's story is a shining example of what loyal faithfulness looks like, what love looks like in the midst of a dark and difficult place. And we are called, we are challenged by Ruth's presence in the genealogy of Jesus to say, look at Ruth's story. There's a reason she's included, even though she's a Moabite woman who ought not to be there in this story. She's there because she demonstrates who God is, what God desires for us. She brings light and hope by demonstrating loyal love, and we ought to see this for ourselves. This is exactly what the story of Christmas is about. This is the story that begins here at Christmas with the birth of Jesus, God born to be with us and among us. As Jesus grows and lives and teaches, we learn in Romans chapter 5, verse 8 of God's intention. God demonstrates His own love for us in this. While we're still sinners, Christ dies for us. This surprising, unexpected, undeserved love and favor of God for His people. God longs to redeem us. God longs to heal us. God has good plans for you. He loves you. He loves us. God is love. And as His people, those who know Jesus, we are called then to shine that love, to be examples, to reflect that love in the world around us. That's why the Apostle Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus, writes in his letter to the church, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sin, which is another way of saying that love, faithful and loyal love, is what turns the world back to God. And the people of God ought to be people who are calling and demonstrating about what it looks like to have that kind of love in our world. What does that kind of love look like in our lives today? What does this kind of faithfulness look like in our lives? Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi become family. There is a commitment and a loyalty expressed there that is a shining example for us. So if we think about it in our own lives, what does that look like? What does it look like to have deep compassion and intense loyalty to the people in our world? To express commitment, to invest sacrificially in the lives of those around us, in the lives of those in need, people who are on the outside. For some, that looks like what we would call unconventional families, chosen family. Those who have chosen to foster or adopt children as their own. Those who have reached out in hospitality to welcome others in, those who have no other family, those who have no place to call home, and say, "This is your home. We are your family. We will walk with you." It means things like taking on responsibility for those who are in need, even though they don't naturally seem to be part of the community or place that we would find ourselves. Ways that this has been expressed here in our community at Fort Garry is through our refugee sponsorship, through some of the discipleship and mentoring relationships that have happened where those who are more mature in their faith have come alongside those who are young and have no connection other than the bond of unity in the Spirit of Christ, and come along and say, "I will be your brother. I will be your sister," and encourage you and walk with you through the dark and difficult things of your life. We see this in the classes and English conversations that we have for those who are newcomers in our community and are looking for ways to belong. And we say, "Come in and sit down and we will become friends together." We call this Christian service. We call this mature discipleship. We call this the way of Christ. This is what faith in Christ looks like on the ground. Can we see this kind of love in others around us? Can we celebrate this kind of love, even if perhaps it's coming from unexpected places? That the presence of God may actually be expressed fully and in beautiful ways in the lives of people that don't fit the picture of who we think ought to express this love. Can we name it as what God intends and desires for each one of us, for his children? Ruth is unexpectedly woven into the tapestry of the story of Jesus, just as you and I have been brought in by the love of Christ and welcomed into the family of God, adopted as children, beloved children of God. In this Christmas season, learning from the example of Ruth, we can pray to God to give us the grace to see others the way that God sees them, as reflections of God's abiding love. Let us walk in this way.